Now, claims and counterclaims today. The Kremlin accusing the US of fueling tensions after President Biden said again that he thought an invasion will happen in the coming days. Then in the east of Ukraine, Russian-backed separatists accused the Ukrainians of violating the ceasefire while launching an attack themselves, which hit a kindergarten. With tensions as high as they are, any provocation presents a serious danger when the stage is set for confrontation. The drums of peace competing with the stubborn drumbeat of war. If the latter prevails, they're going to need a longer wall here outside St. Michael's Cathedral, a shrine to the thousands already killed in the forgotten war of eastern Ukraine. Forgotten, that is, to the rest of the world, but not to this country. The Donbas region in the east of Ukraine has been a frozen front line ever since Russian-backed separatists seized parts of the territory in 2014. These are Ukrainian soldiers on patrol, poised for battle. If there is a Russian incursion, it could happen here. That was certainly the message from the White House today.
How high is the threat of a Russian invasion right now?
It's very high.
Why?
It's very high because they have not moved any of their troops out. They've moved more troops in. Number one. Number two, we have reason to believe that they are engaged in a false flag operation. They have an excuse to go in. Every indication we have is they're prepared to go into Ukraine, attack Ukraine. My sense this will happen within the next several days.
The Russians vigorously deny this. They've put out these pictures today, apparently showing their troops withdrawing from the border, although exactly where from and where to remains a mystery. For now, this is a shadow war where the weapons are information, footage, and the battleground is in the ether. Today's focus is on the eastern Donbas region of Ukraine. This morning, news of an attack from pro-Russian positions on a Ukrainian kindergarten. 3 civilians were injured.
17 февраля.
Then news from the other side in Donetsk of what they claim was an artillery attack against a civilian area, although the only evidence for this were some distant thuds on a mobile phone. But the main claim that could be used as a pretext for an invasion came from President Putin himself a few days ago, when he said that there was evidence of genocide against ethnic Russians by the Ukrainians. Again, no evidence has actually been offered, but the Russian media is talking up the threat with increasing volume. Who isn't using this crisis to do a bit of grandstanding? Mr. Johnson today keen to be seen as the fighter pilot who might launch an ambush, as opposed to the Prime Minister, who suffered a confectionery one. It didn't help that he misunderstood the attack on the Ukrainian kindergarten as that Russian false flag operation. It was a real attack by the Russian-backed rebels against Ukrainian civilians. Back in Kyiv, we were asked to take a tour of the Ukrainian government's anti-cyber warfare headquarters. A rather topical visit, because the biggest attack ever experienced by Ukraine took place just 2 days ago, and they're braced for more to come.
The idea how they can invade is to use cyber weapon to intrude in our systems, to make them unfunctional, and to make our people be in panic.
There is a strange disconnect between the abstract language of threat and counter-threat, all the second-guessing around motives, and then the very undeniable tragedies already caused by this festering standoff between Ukraine and Russia. In the last 8 years, Kyiv has become a city of makeshift shrines to the martyrs of a battle with a neighbour who's gone from friend to foe. Are we about to see the next sorry chapter of this custody battle over one country, with all its global implications? And tonight there are reports that the shelling has resumed in the east of Ukraine, in a similar area to this morning. Well, earlier I spoke to Dmitry Suslov from Moscow's Higher School of Economics, and I began by pointing out that there was no evidence that Russia has actually withdrawn its troops from the Ukraine border.
I think it would be extremely foolish for Russia to withdraw troops without a real progress in implementation of the Minsk agreements and negotiations over the security guarantees. Russia has certainly started to sound in a de-escalatory way. President Putin and Sergei Lavrov claimed that they give a chance to diplomacy, and Russia has declared a partial withdrawal of its troops. Declared partial withdrawal. What does it mean? It means that certain proposals which were brought by Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz were quite interesting for Moscow, and Russia is ready to spend some time and discuss them. Now we will have negotiations. Now we will see how Ukraine proceeds with the implementation of the Minsk agreements after all these diplomatic marathons. But Russia will not withdraw its troops. Russia will not decrease pressure unless there is a substantial and tangible progress. The sword of Damocles will continue to hang until there is a tangible outcome.
Right, so the point is to keep the troops there, keep the stranglehold on Ukraine, keep everyone guessing, and keep the tensions going indefinitely.
Well, I think so. I think so. It was very clear from the very beginning that the concentration of troops was a coercive diplomacy. It was a pressuring exercise on the part of Russia, not actual preparation for invasion, but making impression that Russia could invade. So far, it works, but we'll see how it proceeds in the following days. And there are very mixed signals that Moscow is receiving. On the one hand, Olaf Scholz claims that Zelensky promised implementation of the Minsk agreements, permanent status, constitutional reform, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, only today, President Zelensky of Ukraine said that negotiations with Donetsk and Lugansk are unacceptable, which is contrary to the Minsk agreements. I won't be surprised that Russia brings some troops back after such statement by Zelensky, and we will probably view these troops going back and forth and the overall pressure kept in general during the negotiations, in order to make sure that those negotiations proceed.
Okay, President Putin a few days ago said that there was evidence of genocide against ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. There simply isn't such evidence. And I wonder how dangerous a game he's playing here if he's using that as a pretext for some kind of military action.
At the interstate level, we won't agree on that, right? Because the Russian counter-argument would be that there were also no clear evidence for the genocide of the Kosovo Albanian population back in 1999, but nevertheless, NATO did talk about genocide and used it as an accusation for the illegal NATO aggression against Yugoslavia. And Russia is very fond of mimicking certain types of the Western behavior.
When President Putin talks about genocide in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine, is this, as the Americans claim, the beginnings of a false flag operation, a pretext for an invasion, or is it just another bluff, another part of this strange, phony war?
I won't call it bluff, but at the same time, I won't call it a preparation or an actual beginning of an invasion. I think this is part of the diplomatic game, right? Russia is showing its toughness. Russia is making very, very clear that it is not ready to wait for indefinite number of months, let alone years, and that progress on implementation of the Minsk agreements must be achieved now, just now, within the coming days. And from the Moscow perspective, the West has all the instruments to make it done.
I mean, you talk about a game, but this is a game with very high stakes and potentially lots of tragedy, lots of bloodshed attached to it if it goes wrong. It's a dangerous game, isn't it?
It is a very important issue for Russia. When Vladimir Putin talks about a world war, it means a world war. It means that we are talking about something which is existential for Moscow, right? Russia has already paid quite significant price over the last 8 years. 8 years since 2014, we've been under sanctions and in the state of confrontation with the West which is deteriorating. It means that this is an important issue, and of course Russia is ready to go much further.
But he's playing with fire, isn't he?
Well, I think we all are. You know, from the Russian perspective, NATO enlargement and NATO refusal to cancel the promise that NATO has given to Ukraine back in 2008 is playing with fire. And actually the decision that NATO took at the Bucharest summit in 2008, contrary to the warnings that Vladimir Putin had given in 2007 during his famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, was precisely playing with fire.
Dmitry Suslov, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
Well, the increasing tension has been discussed on the floor of the UN this morning. The United States Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, called on Russia to de-escalate in a Security Council meeting to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Our Washington correspondent Siobhan Kennedy joins me now. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, what we've seen today is something of a coordinated messaging, if you like, from the US administration. We heard from President Biden in your report earlier. There was also messaging from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and from Antony Blinken, as you said, at the UN Security Council. And their message broadly is this: don't believe the hype and misinformation from Russia about them withdrawing their troops, because what we are seeing is exactly the opposite. Lloyd Austin, the Defence Secretary, talked about evidence that troops were in fact inching closer to the border and that they were stocking up even on blood supplies. And Secretary of State Blinken said that Russia was preparing to launch an attack, he said, in the coming days. He said evidence of that was playing out right now, that Russia was working to manufacture a pretext for an invasion, a staged bombing or the like, that it would then use to follow up with a theatrical proclamation that Russia must respond, and then an attack would follow. Secretary Blinken is clearly hoping that by sharing all this US intelligence with the world that he will somehow persuade Russia to back down. There was a direct plea to Russia too. Let's hear from Secretary Blinken now.
I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. So let me make this simple. The Russian government can announce today, with no qualification, equivocation, or deflection, that Russia will not invade Ukraine. State it clearly, state it plainly to the world, and then demonstrate it by sending your troops, your tanks, your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and sending your diplomats to the negotiating table.
Interestingly, Secretary Blinken didn't mention Russia's decision to expel America's second most senior diplomat from its embassy in Moscow today. But a senior source at the State Department told me that the US sees this very much as an escalatory move, an unprovoked move, and that it was considering its response. Matt.
Thanks, Siobhan. That's it from Kiev, but let's go to Christian in the studio in London for more on this story. Krish.
Yes, thanks, Matt. Well, joining me now is the Conservative MP Bob Seeley, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Do you believe we are on the brink of war?
I think it's very likely, yes, to put it bluntly.
Right, well, is that remotely controllable?
False flag operations, provocations, are a way of controlling how you begin the war, because you do it according to your timing and your justification. So a provocation allows Russia to kick off hostilities, claiming not to be the aggressor, because if it simply invades, there's all sorts of sort of international laws against doing that since 1945. So offensive war is illegal. Therefore, it has to provide a justification, and that is the purpose of provocations, false flags ops. This might be a false flag operation that happens now, and Putin may make a decision, reach a decision point to say, actually, I'm going to give it a few more days, but I'm showing what a provocation that will begin the war will look like. But when people say Putin's not really going to invade, well, we had a war in 2014, and lots of people have died, including a plane getting blown out of the sky full of Westerners. Crimea was annexed. I do think we need to be very serious and understand that probably there is a pathway to war, but Putin is playing a very, very aggressive game of bluff. And what he wants is for Minsk to be, for the Ukrainians to obey the Minsk Accords, but not the Russian side. And my fear is that's what the Germans and the French are going to push on the Ukrainians.
Well,
so effectively, Yeah.
I mean, there are things that Ukraine could do that it was supposed to do under the Minsk Accords all those years ago that it hasn't done. Is it not worth trying diplomatic steps to try and avert war?
Yeah, for sure. But the problem with that is that Russia doesn't want to have a war for the sake of having a war. It wants to have a war to achieve its political aims. And what it wants is to be able to reabsorb, divide or destroy Ukraine. And over the next 10 years, regardless of what takes place now, Russia has a very simple set of aims: to reabsorb or divide Ukraine, to shatter the unity of the West and NATO, if it all can, to have a sphere of influence, and to reinforce in the eyes of the Russian people that the West is an adversary and threatens the existence of Russia and the very essence of Russia. And those things are going to be permanent and have been permanent for the last decade, really, in Russian foreign policy. It's just that our political leaders haven't frankly talked about it enough and haven't prepared our own people in this country for what is going to be a much more difficult future.
I mean, you've laid out very clearly the potential of how a false flag operation could go. It doesn't help, though, does it, when the Prime Minister seems to misunderstand what's going on the ground, as he seemed to today, either that or he was given bad information, when he described an attack on a Ukrainian nursery as a false flag designed to discredit Ukraine.
Maybe he misunderstood at the time, and maybe he misheard the question. The key point here, going back, can I just answer the point on the Minsk agreement? You're absolutely right. We should keep talking. Strategic success in 10 years looks like no war with Russia for Ukraine and NATO, and an independent Ukraine still existing. That's strategic success. And if we can achieve that, then we have to absolutely go that extra mile and then some. But the point is, if Ukraine abides by its elements of the Minsk Accord and Russia doesn't, Russia then is able to effectively divide up slowly, county by county, Ukraine, until Ukraine is either plunged into a genuine civil war or Ukraine simply ceases to exist because it's reabsorbed into a new Russian empire.
So just to spell this out, I mean, do you think Ukraine should allow self-government of these rebel regions?
But it won't be self-government of these rebel regions. Look, the local people in these rebel regions all got killed in the first year of war. Most of them were linked to organized crime groups and a few sort of nut job Soviets from around eastern Ukraine and Russia. The so-called paramilitaries in eastern Ukraine are Russian troops minus insignia. The people, as I detailed all this in a RUSI report a couple of years ago when we examined the circle of leaks, all the people involved are effectively directly employed by the GRU on behalf of the Russian state. So they're all Russian actors. So this entire, you're presenting this as sort of rebels backed by Russia. No,
we've shown those as well, to be fair. We filmed them as well. But thank you for your time, Bob Seeley. We must leave it there. Thank you.